If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. We currently have 984 5-star ratings, and it would be great to get that up to 1,000. And to want to give a special thank you to Matthias Kamm, who just gave us this 5-star review. I was a huge sci-fi reader in earlier years, but thanks to this podcast, I've now discovered numerous authors I somehow bypassed. Enjoying Store of the Worlds now by Sheckley. Fantastic. The podcast and Sheckley. Amber is next in the queue. Beyond that, waiting for you for more referrals, David. No pressure. Well, some. So big thanks again to Matthias Kamm for that great review. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 479 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Richard Carrier, who you may remember from our review of Noah back in episode 108, our review of Exodus, Gods, and Kings back in episode 130, and our review of Risen back in episode 192. He holds a PhD in ancient history from Columbia, and is the author of many books, including On the Historicity of Jesus, which is the first peer-reviewed academic book to make the case that Jesus Christ may never have existed. Richard recently summarized those arguments in his new book, Jesus from Outer Space, which is written for a general audience. And we'll be speaking with him today about Jesus from Outer Space, and giving a spoiler-filled review of Michael Moorcock's classic novel, Behold the Man, about a character who travels back in time to witness the crucifixion. And now here's our interview with Richard Carrier. All right, so we're here with Richard Carrier. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, great to be here again.
Okay, so we both just read this novel, Behold the Man, by Michael Moorcock. So just overall, what did you think of the book? Did you enjoy it?
It was okay. It's not my cup of tea generally. The thing that annoyed me the most is funny. It's not the time travel aspect. You talk about the pseudoscience. The pseudoscience of it was too Freudian. Like there's too much Freudian psychology in there, and I couldn't really tell if the author was making fun of Freudian psychology or taking it seriously.
Yeah, so I'll explain. So this book is from 1969, and it's by the British writer Michael Moorcock. And if you don't know, he was a big figure in the new wave in science fiction. So these were people in the 60s and 70s who wanted to make science fiction more literary and more about psychology and less about technology and, you know, sort of more left wing.
Yeah, this book definitely fits in that category. Yeah, he's famous for one big series, the Elric series. I think that's what people know him most for.
Yeah, I think Elric is definitely his best known character. I've read I read the first Elric book, and he's sort of a like the anti Conan the Barbarian, where he's a sort of frail aristocrat rather than a brawny barbarian.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think a lot of what Moorcock was doing was kind of pushing back against things that were out there and kind of poking fun at them. And so yeah, he's definitely doing that.
Yeah.
Certainly to some extent with Behold the Man.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely what's going on in this book, if you give it that perspective. So yeah, since I'm not like a big sci-fi reader, I don't really know like some of that backstory. I know the history stuff that he's playing with, though. That there's some interesting things in there, which I guess is why you have me on.
Yeah. Well, definitely, I have a lot to ask you about that, but I guess I'll just explain a little bit more of the science fiction stuff. So this was originally published as a novella in 1966 in New Worlds, which was Moorcock's magazine that he started to kind of, you know, promote the new wave. And it won the Nebula Award for Best Novella in 1967. And then he expanded it into a novel that was published in 1969, although it's only about 138 pages. So it's still a very, very short novel. And I'd never read this before. I've always wanted to read it because there's a series called the SF Masterwork series. And I've really loved all the ones that I've read, and it's part of that series. So when I decided I was finally going to bite the bullet and read this, I was like, there's no one else in the world I want to talk to about this more. Dr. Richard Carrier.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
So kind of the premise is that there's a British guy, and it's 1970, and he belongs to a Jungian discussion group through which he meets this eccentric aristocrat who's also sort of an inventor, who's invented has invented a time machine. And I guess, what did you think, Richard, of the main character? His name is Carl Glogauer. Kind of, what's your impression of him?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not the best of people, right? Real mess, but that's intentional, right? He's written them. No, so there's a lot of context here that's interesting. So C.S. Lewis, of course, famously came out with the Lord, Liar, or Lunatic apologetic for, like, the Gospels have to be true, because if they weren't, Jesus would have to be actually the Lord, or a liar or a lunatic, and he can't be a liar and he can't be a lunatic, therefore he's actually the Lord. And of course, this is based on ideas of lunatics as just babbling, ranting fools that run around and pull their hair out. But of course, in psychology, we know people who are mentally ill do not act that way. You can believe you're Napoleon. You can have a delusional disorder, totally believe you're Napoleon, or even Jesus. There's lots of people who literally believe they're Jesus and sitting in insane asylums over this, but be completely functional in every other way. So we know, like, the C.S. Lewis's theory of psychology was completely wrong. Someone really could be insane and do this, because insanity doesn't really work the way that C.S. Lewis was sort of stereotypical, bigoted way that he was imagining mental illness. And what Moorcock has done, I wonder if he's, like, thinking of this, right? He's thinking, oh, well, I know some psychology. Let's write a story where Jesus actually is mentally ill, and it explains why he kills himself and everything he does. And so he builds this whole Freudian narrative of this time traveler who goes back, and it's, using Freudian psychology, builds a plausible rationale for why he would do what he did, leading to all the subsequent myths and legends. And so I thought that was a pretty clever kind of take, sort of response to C.S. Lewis. And I wonder if Moorcock is actually thinking of Lewis's argument when he built this.
He may very well be. I mean, one line I really liked that I heard, that the Lewis's liar, lunatic, Lord thing, I heard that referred to one time as a false trichotomy.
Correct.
Which I thought was a good turn of phrase. But yeah. So just to explain, so this guy Carl Glogauer, he goes back in time because he's kind of a religious seeker, and he's gone through all these different phases in his life where he's, experimented with different schools of religious thought and stuff. And so he really wants to witness the crucifixion. And so, spoiler warning, he goes back in time and finds that the Jesus of the Gospels, that's not going to happen unless he makes it happen. And so he ends up becoming, sort of styling himself as Jesus and being crucified. And that's what gets the legends. Yeah.
And then the whole sub story around that, because there's flashes between where he's in the past and then his own past. Right. And then, so there's like his actual past in the 20th century. And then there's this, and it's very much built on this psychosexual history of child abuse that led him to have certain hangups, I guess you would put it. And that at every stage where he's making these decisions that lead to him choosing to be crucified, and thus create the Jesus legend, it's explained in terms of the childhood abuse and his backstory and his life, the kind of like other problems he's had with relationships and things like that. So there's this whole subcategory of psychology going on. Now, a lot of it is kind of, I think, sort of ridiculous Freudian psychology, but so I don't think, if the way we're looking at it now, that I don't think he's like trying to create a realistic psychology thing, but it is realistic within the framework of Freudian psychology is the thing. I think one could write a book based on updated psychology and like actually do a really believable scientific reason why, based on, studies of religious fanatics and cult gurus and things like that. David Koresh, we have there's a lot of really plausible, psychosocial narratives that you could build to do this. It looks like Moorcock is kind of like, in a way, sort of poking fun at Freudian explanations of things. But in its internal logic, it totally makes sense. I mean, from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I really want to talk to you about is how could this story be rewritten in light of developments, not only in psychology, but in biblical studies and so on. But I mean, I really liked this book. I mean, and I think you have a lot more, a lot more about the subject. So you have, I think, a lot more things that would kind of, irritate you than I did. But I thought it was a terrific story. And it seems, at least for 1969, it seems like Moorcock had done his homework on what was sort of known.
Oh yeah, there are allusions in this book to the release of the Dead Sea Scrolls, to Scientology. Like there's a lot of contemporary stuff going on in here. If you don't know the history, you might miss it, right? Actually, I didn't find it very irritating. I don't know if it's a conscious choice or if it's his style as an author. He's very sparse as a narrative or as a narrator. So he builds the scenes very simply, just the basics that you need to know, where someone is, what's going on, and then the conversations, right? And then a lot of it is inner monologue. So all of the opportunities to really screw up history, he bypasses, right? So there's not a lot of stuff. For example, it doesn't go into like how do Jews go throughout their daily day in first century BC, right? Like, so he's not like trying to describe every detail of life. He's not trying to create color, which is where all the mistakes could arise. He's just describing scenes so simply. His narrative is so, I want to say like minimalist in the sense, in the way it's constructed, that he actually escapes a lot of those problems. So it becomes a plausible story in context. So there's not a lot of places where he butts up against history and makes a mistake, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big expert on Moorcock, but I swear I read one time that, I mean, I think he wrote a lot of his novels, especially his earlier novels, very quickly. You know, he said he had like a weekend off, you know, just like bang out a novel.
Sure,
over
yeah.
the weekend. So, I mean, this is definitely, I thought it was well written, but it's definitely very minimalist and just a lot of dialogue and, short sentences and short scenes, which I actually like. I wish more people would write 130-page novels. It would make my job as a book critic a lot easier.
And it works if you do it right? There is a certain skill that has to be deployed, because if you're too simple, it doesn't work or it doesn't engage, right? So there's like this difference between being like a really detailed narrative, like Donna Tartt's Secret History is extremely elaborate narrative, which is beautifully done. That is not Moorcock's style. But to get away with it with Moorcock's style does require some skill, and I do believe he has that from what I've read.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, because this is going to be hard when talking about this book, because you have the present of the story, which is in the past, and you have his past, which is in the present, of chronologically. So I just want to head that off. We might get a little confused,
right? Yeah,
confusing talking about it. But
the reader doesn't get confused. Of course, it's easy to follow the switching back and forth. But yes, while we're talking about it, third hand, people might get lost.
Yeah.
You had asked. You mentioned before about the psychology as the science issue. The only other science issue that I had with it, that I wanted to mention, which is a problem I have with all time travel narratives ever. And there's like an example here where Moorcock gets one thing right, which is like he builds a backstory so that the character can speak Aramaic. Like he already knows Aramaic because he studied it as part of his, background obsession with religions and stuff. So when he ends back there, like he does realistically depict the fact that nobody speaks English, right? So he speaks kind of like a halting Aramaic, and he gets better at it over time. Which is a good solve for a common problem that people overlook, is like, if you're going to go back to first century Judea, you're kind of hosed communication wise, right? Because it's very difficult to do that. And so he at least thought of that part. But there's another part that people forget, which is particularly relevant now in the midst of a pandemic, is virology. The problem with time travel is that if you went back in time, you would probably wipe out the entire population then, and they would probably kill you within months with viruses that you have no immunities to. So I think time travel authors, note to time travel authors, you have to come up with some means of like a universal immunity, so that the time traveler who goes back is not bringing viruses that everybody is not immune to, and is immune to viruses that his body has never encountered.
That's a very interesting point. Although I have to point out that this is not a hard science fiction novel.
It is not, no,
by any means. So I'm going to give you, this is 100% of what we're told about how time travel works. This is the inventor. Quote, "I loathe those ideas that insist on treating time as a dimension of space, describing it in spatial metaphors. No wonder they get nowhere. Time has nothing to do with space. It is to do with the psyche." So that kind of gives you an idea of how
which
how
I
scientific.
like. Right, exactly. Yeah, he just creates the conceit that can create the scenario so that he can build his narrative. I do like that, and that is very. I do know that much, that was a thing, a style of the time, to be at least simplistic in some cases, with like not get hung up on detailing, dilithium crystals or whatever, to explain all the science, or you just throw it away as like you just mention, dilithium crystals, but you don't have to explain the science of it. And when you get into the 80s and 90s, there's much more push in science fiction to like get into the nitty gritty of why does this even make sense? Whereas the writing style, I think then was, he has a time machine. Do we need more explanation?
I thought it works really well. Yeah. And I mean, because you don't find out exactly how he ended up in the past until sort of midway, 2/3 of the way through the story. And right. I thought it worked really well. I mean, it's sort of, it makes as much sense as it needs to. And it's sort of, but it's not what the story's about,
Yeah.
Okay. But so basically he, this guy, Carl, he intends to go back to AD 29 so he can witness the crucifixion, but he ends up arriving a year earlier than he meant to, and so kind of bums around for a year leading up to the crucifixion. And so the first thing that happens is that he falls in with a group called the Essenes and meets John the Baptist. I'm just curious, historically speaking, what did you think of that?
Well, it's fiction, right? So one of the cool things you can do with fiction, especially historical fiction, where we don't know a lot of things historically. So we don't have any evidence that John the Baptist was in any way connected to the Essenes, but we don't have any evidence that he wasn't, right? So that's a gap that you could fill in any plausible way you want. So he's written this story as John the Baptist is kind of like the chosen prophet of this particular Essene sect that's even clearly connected to Qumran, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls were just being published in the beginning of the 60s. And so there's a lot of theorizing, a lot of information. And Moorcock has used a lot of that. He exaggerates it a little bit, but it's at least, within line of the kinds of popular lore that was going out among the public, but not just what was actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also theorizing above and beyond them. Because a lot of writing, a lot of books were coming out about that time about this. Is a big deal. And also the idea that the Qumran sect was an Essene sect, which has never really been established, although it's highly likely they're very similar. But anyway, so he's pulled all this stuff together, and I think he's done it really well. And especially in the context of the knowledge of the 60s at that time, it sort of fits. And so it's a plausible narrative. We don't have, like I said, we don't have any evidence that John the Baptist and the Essenes and the Qumran or any of those people were connected directly like this. But the narrative does make sense. Like it could be a thing. And there are many examples in here where he goes back and he finds that history is not what was written down, right? So he establishes that as a thing which you should expect, right? Like if you go back in time, you should expect that there's going to be all the things that we've kind of inferred about the time or the narratives we've read. Some of them might actually be false. And so that actually fits in terms of like historical fiction.
Is AD 29, is that where you would set your time machine if you were hoping to catch the crucifixion?
Well, so in the book, he says that most historians had determined that Jesus was crucified at the end of 29 or sometime in 29. That's actually, that might have been true then. There's actually a bunch of different dates that have been proposed, and most of them are in the 30s. I think all the dates are bogus because they're all based on theological math in the Gospels that have nothing to do with when Jesus was actually killed. So I don't think we actually can be that reliable, but we can go from Paul and reverse engineer, and we can say it had to have happened in the 30s sometime, but we can't get more direct than that. But 29 is the earliest year ever proposed for the crucifixion of Jesus. So if you want to make sure you don't miss it, then 29 would be the one to go to. Yeah. And that's probably what I would do too, because I would want to, like, it would take you a while to get settled. You'd have to figure out the customs, the language, you'd need to figure out a way to get money so you can eat. Like there's a lot of things you'd have to like sort out, because it's basically like an adventure mission. You're basically like going into the Congo with whatever's on your back, and then you have to like get your base of operations and figure stuff out, and then you can relax and wait for whatever scene or event you're trying to watch, and then while not interfering with anything so as to prevent it. So, which we find out is kind of what this guy does well. Not prevent it, like he actually makes it happen. He finds out that it's not going to happen. Right? That's the sort of conceit. I don't know how much we want to go into for the audience as to what he discovers about the actual Jesus.
I think this is we can do full spoil. Let's do full spoilers. If it comes up. But is John the Baptist 100% historical figure, or?
I'd say 90%. At least in that area, because we have a mention in Josephus that I think some people propose it's an interpolation. I think it's actually pretty authentic. I think it has interpolations in it. In fact, I think that kind of proves that section is authentic, because there's an interpolation there's a Christian who didn't like what Josephus wrote about John the Baptist, so he throws a line in there to try and fix it that only makes sense for a Christian. Like a Jew wouldn't write that line. So someone who's forging it doesn't forge the wrong story and then fix it later, right? So it sounds like Josephus really did write this story about John the Baptist, and then the Christian tried to fix it later with one line, trying to fix the theology of atonement, like as if Josephus would be not only obsessed with theology of atonement, but even think that his Gentile audiences were as well. No, it doesn't make any sense. So I think definitely Josephus wrote that. So it's a high probability that there was a real John the Baptist. And the John the Baptist who shows up in the Gospels, I think, is probably based in a large part on the writings of Josephus about John the Baptist. And there may have been other sources as well. I mean, a lot of the nativity narrative might have actually been adapted from stories told of John the Baptist and porting them over onto Jesus. We don't have proof of this, but it makes sense when you look at the twin nativities in Luke, where you have the John nativity and then you have the Jesus nativity, and okay, it looks like there's some sort of source about John that looks a lot like Jesus. So like I said, can't prove it, but it's the kind of thing that you could play with as an author as a possibility.
Yeah. Well, so he said, yes. So Carl, he goes back in time and hangs out with John the Baptist for a while, and then eventually he makes his way to Nazareth looking for Mary and Joseph and Jesus. So what did you think about the Nazareth section of the book?
So now I'm starting to run more with a comedy theory, because though it's very disparaging the way he depicts the actual Mary and Joseph, and Jesus, of course, is mentally disabled. Like, there's no way he's ever going to become a prophet or do anything. And the Mary and Joseph, like, there's actual infidelity, and they're like awful people, and total Freudian fashion. The hero ends up having sex with Mary, kind of gets raped by Mary, if depending on how you read the narrative. So it's really like, I'm like, whoa, where are we going with this? But in a sense, it is very like, there's this kind of like dark humor going on. I guess, in all of this, which disappoints, of course, Moorcock, who thought that this was going to be some sort of great reverent experience, and it turns out to be the exact
Carl.
I'm sorry, of Carl. Yeah, Carl, the hero, not the author. That was a Freudian slip. So I think I'm now that we're talking about it more, I'm like starting to see different aspects of the way he's constructing the narrative. But religious people will not like this book. I think they'll be very, very offended.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'm not religious at all, but I did like, this was my least favorite part of the book, because it was sort of, it was a little kind of, it was comedic. It was kind of like a little over the top, like
a little seedy, very dark, tragic in a way, but and the simplicity of the style of writing it too, like had a bigger impact. I think it was off-putting in a sense, but I see what the author's doing with it. I see why he's doing that. He has to put his character at to the bottom, basically, like such massive disappointment that he needs to fix it, right? So he needs to create the legend and go through the process.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I just thought I thought the sort of the first act and the third act felt pretty real to me, and then this felt more like satire, like sort of broad.
Yeah, I got that feel too.
But so what do you think if you were to travel back in time, would you go to Nazareth? Is that worth investigating if you're looking for a historical Jesus?
No, if I'm going back in time, I'm freaking changing history. I'm not going to go and just observe shit. So, and if for some reason, I mean, quite frankly, if I had a time machine, I would go in the future so I could get, skip ahead and get immortality. But if I have to go into the past and it has to be the Roman Empire, I would probably pick like right after the victory of Vespasian. Because I from everything I've read, Vespasian seems a very pragmatic fellow. And I feel like I could go there and I could convince him to institute a proper constitutional government in exchange for certain technologies of empire, like the railroad, for instance, and the printing press, possibly gunpowder. And that wouldn't like fix every problem. It would turn the Roman Empire into like the British Empire, basically, which is, a slight improvement, but still pretty far back. But if we could get that constitutional government set in, we could have progress, social progress, as well as scientific and technological progress 1,000 years earlier, and we could bypass the hell of the Middle Ages.
Okay, but if your goal was to establish the historical Jesus thing once and for all,
sure. If that's what I had to do, yeah. What would I go to Nazareth? I mean, I guess if I had time. You know,
I thought that there's a lot of reason to think that Jesus, even if he did exist, never wasn't actually from Nazareth anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the usual argument is that he must have come. That must be the one historically true detail, because why would you add it? This is the Hitchens argument, right? Is they try so hard to have him born at both Nazareth and Bethlehem, and the argument is, why would you do that unless he was really born at Nazareth and you needed Bethlehem to fit in because of prophecy? Now that you'll hear a lot, even from like real scholars in Jesus studies. The problem is that Matthew tells us they both come from prophecy, and Matthew has a tendency to try and double his fits with prophecy, and he's the one who invents the double fit. So he tries to make the prophecy about Bethlehem fit, and he tries to make the prophecy about Jesus being a Nazorian fit, and so he pegs that as he comes from Nazareth. So I think Matthew is inventing this. He's making Jesus come from two different towns because he needs to. And to give you an example of how Matthew does this, famously Mark has Jesus march into Jerusalem on a donkey based on a passage, I think in Zechariah or whatever. And I can't remember if it's Jeremiah or Zechariah, but it's one of the prophets. And there's a story about the Messiah will ride into town on a donkey. And Matthew reads the original text, and the original text is using a Hebrew poetic form of duplication, where you say the same thing over and over again in different words. And he mistakes the references in the original scripture as Jesus riding into town on two donkeys, a mama donkey, an adult donkey, and a baby donkey, the foal of the mother donkey, simultaneously. So Matthew has written this absurd scene where Jesus is somehow straddling an adult donkey and a baby donkey simultaneously riding into town, just to make it fit more literally with scripture. I mean, it's an absurd scene, but it shows you how Matthew's trying to duplicate things to try and make things fit scripture better. And Matthew's the one who invents the idea that Jesus was born at Bethlehem. And so, like, he's adding that in. And he gives us the reveal that even the Nazareth origin comes from scripture. Now, it's a scripture that's been lost. And we know there's scriptures said different things and have back then than they do now. So it's some scripture that was lost, but he doesn't specify exactly where it is, but he does say it comes from scripture. So that's probably where Mark got it too. And there's no reference to Nazareth, or Nazarenes or anything like that in Paul. So the first it appears is in Mark, and then the double birth narrative appears in Matthew and so on. So I think that there's no basis for Jesus actually coming from Nazareth. And there's a lot of other reasons why I think that's unlikely, but, so it wouldn't be high on my list of things to check. For the first thing I would want to check is to see, because if it's 29, I'd want to sit around and wait until someone's talking about this particular prophet. I would try to I would have inroads to all the local sects and see what's brewing, what's going on, and so on, and trying to figure that out. And I would use it as double duty as a historian to just document all kinds of cool shit that's unrelated to Jesus, right, while I'm there. So. And then maybe leave it in a time capsule, right? Like put it in a pot and bury it. So like a new Nag Hammadi discovery will have all my time traveler books about the era.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I told you I was kind of interested in how could this story be rewritten from a mythicist perspective. And so I just imagine, Carl would go back in time to 29 or whatever and look around, and there's no Mary and Joseph and Jesus or anything in Nazareth, and there's no like trial or like you say, like the market, or the temple, when Jesus drives the moneylenders out of the temple, you say that temple was actually like this giant fortified, armed battalions guarding it and stuff. And
yeah, it's an impossible scene. Right. And so, how would I write this book? And how would we write it if we knew Jesus didn't exist? Now, in a sense, it's funny that Moorcock's book does qualify as minimal historicity in the sense that there is a Jesus. He's just not the one who becomes the crucified one. And there is an actual guy who gets crucified and gets called Jesus. So that would actually qualify in my
and that's what is,
methodological scheme is historical.
That establishes the myth, right?
Yeah. But the mythicist thesis, for people who are not aware, is the idea that there wasn't even that, right? Is the idea that the crucifixion, this Jesus who was crucified, is something that was only known through visions. This is the alternative theory, that there was no actual crucifixion, that they just were told it in Revelations that this crucifixion had occurred somewhere, possibly in the sky, possibly in some other, distant realm or whatever. But it wasn't something people witnessed. It was some sort of cosmic crucifixion affected by demons at the behest of Satan and so on. And then they went around preaching this, and it wasn't until decades later that this got what's reified, basically what's called euhemerized. It got turned into a historical narrative of a guy walking around Galilee and stuff to sort of allegorize and tell the story. But that wasn't how the religion began. It didn't begin with that version of thing. And it's similar to the cargo cults, where the original cargo cults, which are these early 20th century Melanesian Messianic cults that arose, that kind of syncretized Christianity with local pagan cults of those islands. And they began with shamans who would hear secret messages, spirit messages, by putting their ears to telegraph poles. And that's how the gospel, their gospel originated, is there were a bunch of shamans. There was no single founder. Bunch of shamans were getting these communications, and they just sort of emerged into a collection of teachings. And then about, a few 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, all the teachings got assigned to this messianic figure called John Frum. In some islands, it's Tom Navy. In some islands, it's Prince Philip, who supposedly came to the island and gave them all those teachings. So they create a historical founder who never existed in the first few decades of the religion. And then all subsequent teaching of that religion, it's all attributed to that one messianic figure. So Jesus mythicism, the peer-reviewed academic version of it, is that that's how Jesus was actually created, that he's like the cargo cults. It started with revelations. Decades later, he was turned into this person with a narrative, and he gets killed by the Romans and stuff. That's all fiction, meant to teach lessons about history, lessons about theology and cosmos and things like that.
Right.
So if that were the case, and you went back as a time traveler, what you would find is that you would find, like, depending on when you went, but you would find Peter, probably it was Peter who started all this, Peter having the original revelation of this, and then inspiring his Council of 12, because he was probably running a sect of Essenes, perhaps, or something like that, some radical fringe sect. And then they all claim or actually have visions confirming his vision. And then, so then they go evangelizing, and that's how the religion begins. And then Paul, tries to persecute the church. Then eventually he claims to have a vision that converts him, and so on. And so everybody's having these revelations. That's what you would find. You could Moorcock it, in a sense, by having the person go back and there's nothing. And so they have to pretend to be Peter, pretending to have this vision and starting their religion that way, and then thinking that they have changed history, not realizing that decades later they would just turn it into a narrative about a historical Jesus crucified by the Romans, and then the whole history would proceed as exactly.
As a time traveler, how would you find Peter? Do we have any idea where or when he would have been having these visions?
Not really. So we know they're based in Jerusalem, but of course Jerusalem was possibly tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands population. There's been disagreements as to that. The low population counts are about 70,000 people. No phone book. So, I don't know how you'd find a particular person among 70,000 people in an ancient city. That would probably take a while. You could probably do it. So we don't know. We know they were based at Jerusalem after they started evangelizing, but that doesn't really tell us where they started, right? So if you wanted to get there ahead of time, you'd be pretty clueless. You would have to follow what fringe sects look the most similar, and then basically stalk them, stake them out, and then see where the trends are. And then maybe if some guy comes around claiming that he's the Kephas, the stone, the rock, and then you go, okay, that's it. But now what if Kephas named himself after the religion began? Now you've got a really difficult challenge. Was he named Simon, as Acts claims that he was originally named, or the Gospels claim he was originally named? Maybe. We don't know for sure. So it would be a challenging thing to try and figure it out. You could probably do it, but it would depend. And if you're writing fiction, historical fiction, you could come up with a way that would make sense.
I'll mention you. I also read you have a recent book out called Jesus from Outer Space, and I'm going to mention a couple things from that. But one of the things that you mention is that there were, in the Talmud, it mentions a Jesus, and some early Christians believed that there was a Jesus who had lived during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, who died in 76 BC. So if you had a time machine, would there be any points in going back to then and seeing if there was any Jesus there?
That is a valid point. And so for people who don't know this, there's a Western chronology and an Eastern chronology. So in the Western chronology is the one that everybody knows, where Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate, we know from other sources that Pontius Pilate governed Judea between 26 and 36 AD. So if you wanted to go see someone get crucified by Pontius Pilate, that's the window you would go into. Now, outside the Roman Empire, in the Parthian Empire, separate and completely separate political and social and cultural atmosphere, you have the Babylonian Hebrew community, the Babylonian rabbinical community, eventually put down all their stories into their Talmud called the Babylonian Talmud. There was also a Jerusalem Talmud, but the Jerusalem Talmud never mentions Jesus or Christianity. However, it's fragmented. We don't have the complete Jerusalem Talmud, whereas we do have the complete Babylonian Talmud, and it does frequently mention Jesus and Christians. But weirdly, it always places the Jesus myth, or the story of Jesus' execution, 100 years earlier. It puts it in right after the death of Alexander Jannaeus in some sort of Hellenized Jewish context, and he's stoned by the Jewish authorities. There's no Roman, because Romans aren't there yet. He's stoned by Jewish authorities in Joppa, not outside Jerusalem. And so there's this whole different narrative. He's placed in a completely different century. And it's definitely the same guy. It's Jesus of Nazareth. Mother was Mary, the whole thing. So a lot of people don't know that we have these two versions. Now, usually because the Babylonian Talmud was written in the Middle Ages, basically the early Middle Ages, or at least the end of antiquity, and we have no earlier references to this Eastern chronology. So that's usually just dismissed as some sort of change or error or whatever. It's actually hard to explain if you think about it. If there was an actual historical Jesus, it's much easier to explain if there wasn't, because then that means in different empires, people were free to place him in history whenever that was politically and socially relevant to them. And if in the Roman Empire, it would be Roman Judea, that would be exactly where you'd put it, because that would have the political resonance you needed. But that wouldn't have any political meaning outside the Roman Empire. So they were free to put it somewhere else. And so there's a lot of Jewish history that they could use to place their idea of where Jesus would have lived. So if Jesus didn't exist, it makes more sense of why there are these two traditions.
But would it be worth investigating, or do you think it's like so clearly a myth that it wouldn't be worth the time to travel back in time?
I think it's low, but not vanishingly low probability. So I think, I would say let's say 10% chance you go back to the 30s AD and you find out, oh crap, no, it was the 70s BC. And then hopefully your time machine isn't broken like Carl's was. And then you go, okay, we got to jump back a little bit further. But otherwise, if you were setting out ahead and you only had one destination, I would not know what to recommend to you. Like, well, your best odds are at the 30s AD, but you could be wrong. Might be the 70s BC or neither. That's the problem with ancient history. It's vexed with problematic sources.
Yeah. I also think just if you're to write this as a novel, it seems like there's all sorts of characters that you mention in Jesus from Outer Space who would be interesting to bring into the story. And I don't know if the chronology works or not. I guess it depends on what time exactly you were traveling to. But you mentioned I'll just read this passage. You say, with colorful names like the Samaritan, the Egyptian, the imposter, and one mysteriously named Theudas, these guys got into actual military battles with Roman soldiers, hence they made the history books. There's another one called Eleazar the Exorcist, who are like other sort of Messiah figures who I think are historical.
Yeah. People might be interested to look on the internet. I have a talk called You're All Gonna Die. And it was my talk I delivered in Wichita for the camping prediction of the end of the world. It was on the day the world was supposed to end, according to Harold Camping. And so I gave this Wichita talk on the end, and the talk title was, I think, officially, "You're All Gonna Die: How the Jews Kept Failing to Predict the End of the World and Accidentally Caused Christianity." And so it's kind of a humorous narrative, but it's all historically true that I go through. But one of the points I make, later in that talk is that you have all these messianic figures trying to, well, as Josephus paints them, they are deliberately trying to portray themselves as a new Joshua. And for people who don't know, Joshua is just Jesus. Those are the same word. They just get transliterated differently in modern translations. Jesus is Joshua. It's the same name. In ancient texts, there's no difference between them. So these guys are trying to portray themselves as the new Joshua. They're trying to part seas, topple walls miraculously, and doing all the Joshua things. And that would be very messianic, because Joshua is the one who conquered the Israeli Holy Land. And so to be the new Joshua, you're portraying yourself as the new conqueror. And then they're portraying themselves as messianic, as bringing upon the end of the world. which makes them a Christ, right? So these are all Jesus Christs, according to Josephus. He doesn't use the word Jesus or the word Christ, but he describes them in such a way that this is clearly how he would have conceptualized them. And so we know there are tons of these guys trying to get themselves killed at the same time deliberately, because as the book of Daniel says, the book of Jeremiah said, that the reason God wasn't bringing about the end of the world is because of the sins of the Jews. And only when the Jews would stop sinning would he come and do it. But if you have this great sacrifice, as the book of Daniel has the guy die, it's when the Messiah in Daniel 9, when he dies, there's kind of, it sort of relates this to an atonement for sins. And so if his death can atone for all the sins, then the sins are canceled. Now God has no reason not to bring about the end of the world, and so he does. And so it looks like there's a ton of these guys trying to make this happen. They're trying to preach the end of the world, get themselves killed so that their sins can atone and appease God, so God will finally come and wipe out the Romans, et cetera, et cetera. And so it seems like this is a trend of things. And so Christianity would fit historically into that. So if you went back there, you might have the problem that there's like 50 Jesus Christs and they're all getting themselves killed, and for the same reason. And so that could be very challenging for a historian.
But your hero could be the Samaritan or the impostor or Theudas,
right? Because these are all nicknames, right? They're not the actual name. Even Jesus might be a nickname. It just means God's Savior. So that's a very suspicious name. A guy named God's Savior becomes God's Savior. So that sounds almost like it's an assigned name, not an actual original name. So, and it well could be, right? And so it would be hard to figure out like which one was actually the one.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a whole list here of like sort of suspiciously convenient names. So Barabbas means son of the father. Judas means Jew.
Yeah.
Cyrus means awaken. There was one thing in Moorcock's book where I'd never heard this before. He says that the written words for son of a carpenter and magus were almost the same and could easily be confused.
Yeah. I looked into that. So I don't know Aramaic, so I couldn't do that. I did some research to find that. I could not find that anywhere. So I don't know where he got that information. Here, I have a note on it. Let me find it. Do you remember what page it's on?
113 in
Here
my
it is. Yeah.
edition.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So what does he say? The written words for son of a carpenter and magus were almost the same, and the confusion had come about in this way. Now, I suspect there's probably some scholar wrote this at some point in some journal or something in the 60s, and Moorcock got a hold of it, and that's what he's repeating. I think that's probably more likely than that he's just making this up. So the word is haras, which it means craftsman. So, and I think that the logic of it is also, okay, yeah, so I did check this out. So there is logical. The logic of it is that craftsman could theoretically mean source, like witches' crafts, right? So like sorcerer and craftsman, you could think they overlap. Now, I didn't find any actual evidence that was ever the case, that they ever referred to witches or sorcerers as craftsmen. But one could speculate that they did. So I think like there's at least a connection to the Aramaic in there. And he's exaggerated it just a little bit, into, like eliding all of the scholarly inferences that go from A to B and just making, it could mean the same thing. There are a few other places in the book where he does that. Like, he goes through when he describes the Essenes, and he gives a list of things. The Essenes sound just like the Christians, and he's taken actual writing about modern scholarship about the Essenes and exaggerated it a little bit. So, for example, it says, well, they also taught love your neighbor as yourself. And it's like, well, that's sort of true, but not directly true, right? So, like, it's a bit of you're glossing over a bunch of inferences, right, from the evidence to a conclusion. And he's just presenting it as, oh, this is what Carl learned about the Essenes. And then having it turn out to be true because he goes down there and finds it. So as a historical fiction, it works. But I wouldn't use this as a historical book.
Well, I mean, sort of the clear implication to me, you can tell me what you think about this, is if the Aramaic words for carpenter and magician are easily confusable, that the idea that Jesus was a carpenter might have come after the idea that he was a magician, and someone just got confused about that point at somewhere along the way.
Actually, the current scholarship on the confusion would not be that confusion. I do know that ideas were bouncing around of Jesus having been mistaken as a magician, because that's what the Talmud says, that he was a magician who learned his sorcery in Egypt, etc. And so that's a Talmudic belief. And but the thing is, the most common view is that the word for craftsman that appears in the Greek of Mark, because this is the first we hear of this, by the way, is in Mark. We don't hear of it anywhere else. But the word is the same word that is used to refer to God as the creator, the craftsman of the universe, right? So when Mark writes the scene that is this not like they're saying, how can he work miracles? Isn't this guy just the carpenter? That's actually a joke, right? It's a joke for the reader. They are not realizing that they're talking to the craftsman, as in the creator of the universe. And of course, at this time when this was written, the creator was an assigned being. So this wasn't Trinitarianism. When you look in Paul, the view is that God created Jesus at the beginning of time and then told Jesus to make everything. So Jesus is the actual artificer, the actual architectos, the actual craftsman of the universe, following God's orders, basically. And so when Mark is writing, he's creating a sort of hidden joke, a sort of irony. Mark loves irony, by the way. It's in every single chapter of his book is filled with irony. So this irony is that the Jewish elite there are not figuring out that this is actually the guy that God assigned to create the universe. So that they're saying, but he's merely the craftsman, right? And so that's the ironic joke, right? And so I think that the idea was created on purpose by Mark as a joke. I don't think there was ever any actual legend that Jesus was a craftsman. So that's the thing that you'll find more commonly discussed in scholarship today. But as historical fiction written in 1969, I think that's a clever little bit there, the confusion of craftsmen with magus to invent that.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned, or you mentioned in Jesus from Outer Space that there were all these dying and rising gods and virgin births and savior cults all in this sort of time and place. And there were even Romulus passion plays. So you say it was basically just like the Jesus passion plays, just for Romulus before Jesus would have been crucified or anything.
Yeah.
Could you have a character like a time travel character like Carl interacting with people who, could he watch a Romulus passion play or meet somebody who was a follower of Zalmoxis or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where he went, right? So this does actually come up with something I did make a note on in the book. So if you wanted to see a play like that, that would be a pagan ritual. It would have to be in a pagan city. It's not going to happen in Judea. Now, there were a few cities in Judea that had pagan quarters, but even those appear to have adhered to Jewish law. So they kept their paganism indoors, basically. Now, there is, if you look, there are some Hellenized cities on or around the borders of Judea that would. Tyre is an example. So the Gospels have Jesus visit Tyre, or at least come near the city of Tyre. Now, Tyre was rife with some of the most prominent pagan passion plays and rituals, and a lot of mystery cults were there. So that is a place where you might have seen a Romulus play performed. You would also probably have seen the pageants of other religions that had dying and rising motifs, like the Inanna Tammuz cult, which was centered there. There's the Hercules Melkart cult was there. And so there's a lot of these dying and rising cults, mystery cults that were actually centered there in Tyre. So you could do that. Zalmoxis cult was Celtic. So you might see that, you might find that religion in Galatia, where Paul wrote letters to the Galatians. Galatians means Celts, by the way. So it's because of Celtic invasion hundreds of years earlier in the middle of Turkey, or what is now Turkey, was a whole, basically, center filled with, Celts that had settled there. And so the Galatians that Paul's writing to are actually Celtically influenced. So they would know of Zalmoxis cult. Now, whether there would be any of their adherents so far down south that you would see stuff like that in Tyre or in the Decapolis, the 10 cities of the Greeks that are just adjacent to Judea, I don't know. We don't have any direct evidence that the Celtic mysteries were that far south. They may have been, but we don't know. But the thing that reminds me of the book was in page 113. It's the same page that we were just talking about. He has a paragraph where he talks about how Galilee was very Gentile, was filled with Gentiles. And this doesn't become a major plot point, but he does talk about it. Now, this is a good example of something that was going on at the time in scholarship in the 60s, is this idea was being pushed a lot, that they were taking the scriptural reference to Galilee of the Gentiles seriously and proposing the view that there was a lot more Gentiles in Galilee than in Judea. Galilee's just north of Judea, right? And the idea being that the reason Jesus is depicted as hanging out with a lot of Gentiles, which is weird, is that, oh, well, there must have been a lot of Gentiles around. And now that's since been kind of refuted. The scholarship has gone in and found that there are very few Gentiles in Galilee. It wasn't like that at all. But Moorcock is working from scholarship of his time, and you see that reflected in there. The truth is the Galilee of the Gentiles just meant that it was, this was like way, way, way before, centuries before this time. And it was more of a political term rather than, it had more to do with, there were a lot of separate nations in there. It didn't necessarily refer to non-Jewish dominance of the region. And so the scholarship now is pretty much saying that the Galilee of the Gentiles didn't mean Galilee of the Gentiles. It meant something else. And so there's no evidence of a heavy Gentile presence in Galilee. So that's changed. The scholarship has changed. But Moorcock wouldn't know that. He would be working with what was to him the latest cutting edge scholarship, which in the 60s was arguing that the Gentiles were prominent in Galilee.
Mm-hmm. I also just want to give you a chance to talk about Jesus from Outer Space, because it sounds like, just from the title, it sounds like a very sci-fi kind of book. And
it has a sci-fi cover, which I really love. Rena Devon is the artist of that. Did a fantastic job creating the cover art. So for people who don't know, I published a peer-reviewed academic monograph on this, which is on the history of City of Jesus back in 2014. I have since condensed it down into a colloquial pop market summary of the thesis there. And it's like 200 pages, I think. It's not a lot. I can't remember now. Is it 200 pages? Well, it's in that vicinity. It called Jesus from Outer Space. And it's just no footnotes, just a quick few chapters to get you introduced to the theory and its context and why it makes sense. And the idea, the central concept in the title is that the first Christians believed Jesus was a space alien. They believed he came down from outer space. And this is true even if he existed, right? So we see this even in the writings of Paul, even if there was a historical Jesus, from the earliest we have, they're talking about him being a pre-existent alien being who lived up in outer space, literally, and lived up there somewhere and flew down and became incarnate, assumed a body like a bodysuit of a mortal man, walked around on earth and then got himself killed. And so even the first Christians, even if there was a historical Jesus who was actually crucified by Pontius Pilate, the first Christians were preaching that he was this space alien. He was like Klaatu from Day of the Earth Stood Still. And that was their view. And you really don't understand the origins of Christianity if you don't understand this. And there's a lot of pushback against it because of the anachronistic belief that, that he didn't come from outer space. Like, he came from heaven. And it's like, yes, but back then that was outer space. The idea that heaven was an other dimension that's not, you can't get to it in this universe, it's somewhere else. That idea is modern. That did not exist back then. Back then, heaven was literally up there. You could point to it. If you had a telescope, you could watch it. If you had a rocket, you could go to it. And that was what the heaven was. And it's actual planets up there, and people live on the planets, and they're, angelic, superior beings, which means space aliens, right? These are extraterrestrials, literally. So that literally Jesus was from outer space in the earliest Christian teaching. Now, once you accept this and you understand this is the view that they had of the world and the view of Jesus, the idea that they were imagining Jesus through revelations rather than actually meeting him on earth makes a lot more sense. So if you put it in its original context, you start to realize that this idea, that the religion began in revelations, as Paul says, and was only turned into a historical Jesus decades later, or I should say an earthly Jesus to be more specific, that actually makes a lot more sense when you start looking at it in context. And that explains the title of the book, and then the book goes into detail as to why all the objections to this don't make any sense, and that's the purpose of the book.
Well, yeah, let me just read this passage from Moorcock's book, which I think puts this really well. He says, "The Essenes had seen stranger things than his time machine. They had seen men walk on water and angels descend to and from heaven. They had heard the voice of God and his archangels, as well as the tempting voice of Satan and his minions. They lived constantly in the presence of God and spoke to God and were answered by God when they had sufficiently mortified their flesh and starved themselves and chanted their prayers beneath the blazing sun of Judea."
Yeah. A really accurate psychological explanation of vision culture, which was going on at the time. So yeah, that's actually accurate. I don't know to what extent the Essenes specifically engage in those specific actions, but those were common ways. Sleep deprivation, mortification, actual, beating yourself until, repetitiously and ritually for like hours on end until you start hallucinating. These were techniques known at the time of ways to hallucinate. And these sects, especially these fringe sects, were very obsessed with having visions. And so they were looking for ways to do it. And a lot of them might have attracted schizotypal persons, which is people who don't have schizophrenia, but are highly prone to hallucinate. And so it's another example of where they're not mentally ill, but they do hallucinate rather readily. And these are cultures that fully accept them and accept these hallucinations as real encounters with the divine. They thought even dreams, by the way, you could meet gods and angels and demons in dreams. And that was, from their point of view, you were actually meeting them. Your soul was going somewhere and meeting them and encountering them for real. So this was definitely an accurate portrayal of the zeitgeist of that time. I mean, that people were having these visions all the time. And this is another example of how you have to understand it in context. We have a very hallucination hostile culture now, where hallucination is immediately medicalized as a mental disorder. No, it's not respected as real, and so on. This is a radically different culture that we live in now from what was going on back then. In that culture, hallucinations were respected as real visions, and you could actually move up in the ranks of a religious movement the more and more fascinatingly you hallucinated encounters with the divine. So hallucination was respected as a real component of their culture at the time. And this, again, explains the context of the origins of Christianity much more than our anachronistic understanding today.
Yeah. Could you talk about, this was kind of new to me. This is from Jesus from Outer Space. You say, even the author of the book of Revelation seems to have believed Jesus was born in outer space, describing his mother as a celestial being who was pregnant in heaven, and while pregnant had to escape Satan's clutches in heaven, and whose baby was snatched up to be hidden near God's throne in heaven.
Yeah. It does appear to say that. Yeah. Now, what exactly is going on there?
No dispute about that that's what it says? Or?
Well, so the view, there's a lot of, scholars aren't decided on this, right? So there's a lot of debate as to what's going on in here. Some of the view is that there's a simultaneous cosmic drama, that there's something going on in the heavens that is copying what's going on Earth, so that you can have it both ways, right? So you can have, there's the actual historical Jesus narrative, but then at the same time, there's this something going on in outer space is the same stuff. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that all the cosmic stuff is allegory for earthly stuff, so that even though Revelation is literally describing all this going on in outer space, it's really a secret code for stuff that went on Earth. And that's another interpretation. There's not really good evidence for any of these interpretations. The one thing that we do know is that the author of Revelation is being highly allegorical, highly symbolical, is not writing directly literally. So that leaves open a huge amount of interpretations as to what's going on. It's very similar to the Revelation's use of the number of the beast. And it describes the number of the beast as, either 616 or 666. There's different manuscripts that say different things. People try to say that must mean Nero, but it doesn't actually outright say it's Nero. So you have to kind of like go through stages of inferences to sort of say, well, it must mean Nero, but maybe it means someone else, or maybe it means something else. Maybe it means someone in the future. We really don't know, because he's writing deliberately cryptically, whoever wrote the book of Revelation. And so that it runs into the same problem. Nevertheless, it does certainly seem like he's talking about cosmic events. And it may be that, like, this is the stuff that these are the secrets that you're supposed to be revealed, that if you are a true initiate, you will understand that all of this stuff did in fact take place in the heavens exactly as he's describing, and you will understand what they mean. Which is the key thing. Like he's writing it as sort of space drama, but all of these events actually have other cosmic meanings. There's other things that happen in the universe based on these events, and so his idea is that the true initiate will understand what the secret meaning is, but from analyzing the celestial events. So I wouldn't use it as slam dunk evidence that Christianity originally taught a celestial drama. We have to infer that from other evidence. But it is supporting evidence. It does jive with it. It agrees with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you say also, Paul believed the Garden of Eden resided in outer space, somewhere in the vicinity of Venus or the sun. So, I mean, it seems like there was a lot of
we have this
going on.
We have this in the early book called the Book of Adam and Eve. It's one of these scriptures that didn't end up in the canon later, which clearly was used by Paul. The early Christians regarded it as scripture because Paul's referencing in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul references the life of Adam and Eve. He doesn't cite the book, but he talks about paradise being in the third heaven, and that either he or someone he knows visited there. He went there in some fashion to get secret messages from alien beings up on the third heaven. And in the life of Adam and Eve, we know that that's where the original Garden of Eden was. And then when Adam and Eve fell, the fall of Adam, it was literally falling from the third heaven to earth. So we know that there was this Jewish lore that the paradise originally, the original Adam and Eve, and that means original garden, original soil from which Adam was formed, and everything resided up in the heavens. And probably in their conception, this would mean, it depends on which geocentric scheme they were using as to whether it would be the sun or Venus. Different possibilities based on which order of planets you put. But they're basically like living there is the idea. That's where the paradise was. That's where Adam and Eve originally lived, and where Adam and Eve are still buried, according to the life of Adam and Eve. The angels come down and get their bodies and bring them back up and bury them in paradise in heaven. So yeah, this is really weird, right? This sounds very sci-fi, but this was normal cultural belief at the time.
Yeah. I mean, this is also, I love this stuff so much, and this is so interesting. We're almost out of time, but I did also just want to mention that you had an appearance last year on the Daily Atheist Morning Show talking. It's like a full hour just about science fiction. I'll tease some of the topics.
Oh, yeah. That was a good talk. I really enjoyed that. There's a lot of interesting points we hit.
Yeah, you can hear Richard talk about how Aristotle was a science fiction author, how Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was his introduction to philosophical sci-fi, how Roy Batty from Blade Runner is a good example of secular morality, and how Battlestar Galactica really captures what it's like to live on a big ship.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend that.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in there.
Yeah. And again, that's the Daily Atheist Morning Show with Richard Carrier. All right, so why don't we start wrapping this up? Richard, do you have any final thoughts or any other projects you want to let people know about?
The only big thing going on now is that I do teach courses online every month. Simple, easy, affordable courses. Requires some self-motivated learning, but you get to talk. You get to ask me all the questions you want for a month. An expert in various fields, and I teach in philosophy and history, various subjects. You can go to my blog at richardcarrier.info, and you can find the classes link to look and see what kind of classes I teach. They're super cheap. Super simple things on various subjects, and everything else you want to know about me, my Facebook wall, my Twitter feed, my blog. If you want to find my books, I've written many books, almost all of them available on Audible, read by me as well. All of that stuff you can find at richardcarrier.info.
All right, great. So we've been speaking with Richard Carrier about his book, Jesus from Outer Space, and about Michael Moorcock's novel, Behold the Man. So Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I always love it.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Richard Carrier for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.